Hi, welcome back to Painting with Bennett, and I hope you're doing well. I'm back with part 2 of the Hivestorm box painting process, this time painting some jumpy boys. And by that I mean not the bug jumpy boys, but the human jumpy boys, the Tempestus Aquilons. Whereas for the vest bit, I didn't really have much of an inspiration for a custom color scheme. For the Aquilons, I decided that I wanted to paint them in a Dead Space video game inspired paint scheme. There's a lot of little bits on these minis that I think work really well for the glowing blue effect, especially the big bug-eye eye lenses and the little helmet flashlight thing that sort of like sits off to the side on their head. And as a bonus, I think this scheme is also super easy to paint. I'll show painting these minis both with and without an airbrush because it's honestly very similar. It's just subbing out one or two airbrush steps for a couple of dry brushing and layer steps instead. And honestly, I think the result looks like very, very similar. And yeah, I just really like this Dead Space suit-inspired scheme. I know that maybe a team like Navy Breachers might be, technically more suited to this look, might be more lore-fitting. But I just decided that this is the human team that I have, and I really wanted to paint this look, and I still think it turned out really cool. So, nothing like a whole bunch of model assembly to kick things off. I do think that these minis are sort of an egregious example of the Games Workshop trend of adding way too many details and overcomplicating some of their minis. These guys have so many straps and little armor details and things going on, and I think the box art scheme really doesn't do them any favors in this regard. So, since there's so much going on sculpt-wise, I'm going to try and balance that out with a more simple paint scheme, making them a bit more monochromatic, and I do think that the Dead Space inspired paint scheme will do an excellent job of that. I didn't bother doing much magnetization, but I did magnetize the Servo Sentry's guns, since it was fairly easy to do, and I can realistically see myself swapping them out often depending on the matchup. I kind of regret that I built all of these before you could take the Melta Gunner in addition to the Plasma Gunner, you had to pick one or the other, but I'll probably just pretend that one of these troopers also has a Melta Gun if I need to. I also didn't bother drilling out the gun barrels. I might go back and do that in the future, but for now I'm not too fussed about it. The assembly took quite a while for me to do, especially with quite a few mold lines to clean up, but with that done, I primed them all with Monument Black-Brown Primer. As a quick aside, I'm showing how I painted the team with an airbrush right now, and I'll show the modifications I made for the no airbrush painting steps at the end of the video. I airbrushed the mini all over with this Crix Green base coat, and then I airbrushed a shade only in the shadows with a mix of Crix Green and Black, thinned quite a bit so that it doesn't cover too heavily. Then I did a zenithal highlight with Bane Gray, and this made things pretty light right now, but it will be darkened down quite a bit later. And for now, that's all the airbrush work done establishing the initial colors. Moving on to the brushwork steps, I painted the black leather straps and guns and such with a mix of Grim Black and Noble Skin speed paints. Ideally, I would have done this after the next upcoming dry brushing step, but I had this paint on my palette and in the process of drying when I was painting my no airbrush mini alongside this one, and I didn't want to waste that paint, so I just did this part now. When that was dry, I dry brushed the black parts with a light gray mix, and doing this at this step gives a pretty easy, low effort highlight, and this light gray will basically be invisible against the airbrushed colors, so any sort of messy dry brush spillover doesn't really matter. Then I dry brushed the armor, which is most of the mini, with a lighter mix of Bane Gray and an off-white color, which also helps to cut down on having to do a whole bunch of edge highlighting later. The armor is looking, definitely pretty light right now, but again, it'll be toned down quite a bit with a wash later on. Then I finished base coating most of the other surfaces. I used this rock hide color on the browns, like the pants and underclothing and etc. Then I used this hammered copper color for all the metal bits, and I tried to keep all of the motifs painted consistently. For example, every little skull on the minis is painted in copper, not like half of them copper and half of them black or brown or some other color. Then I picked out a couple armor panels that will end up being orange, and I base coated them with this Pro Acryl orange-brown color. I picked the outer shoulder armor pauldrons and the sort of outer grav backpack thing, like exhaust cylinder armor bits. Most of my base coats have just been one coat, but this one I thinned down my paint a decent amount and did 2 thin coats. Then, with all of the colors blocked in, I mixed up a brownish black wash, roughly 2 parts black wash to 1 part brown wash, and I slopped this on all over the Mini. I'm purposely using an acrylic wash as opposed to something like an oil wash, because the acrylic wash will also knock down and unify the colors across the model. Also, I feel like the Pro Acryl washes do a really great job of drying decently level and without too much like really noticeable coffee staining. So to me, the surfaces won't look too overly messy when the wash is really slopped on. Now this also does darken everything down quite a bit, but I'm intentionally keeping the non-object source lighting colors on this Mini generally pretty dark. I want the OSL to really pop a ton, and for that it needs to be brighter than any other parts of the Mini. With that dry, I started on the highlights, first starting with the browns, just mixing some light umber into my base coat color of rock hide, and applying that as a highlight, and then doing a highlight of pure light umber. Honestly, you can use any lighter brown color for the highlight here, it doesn't matter specifically what you use. And you can do this at any point, but right now I also stopped to apply a slightly thinned down white color to all of the parts that I want to be glowing. These are the things like the eye lenses, the vents, the plasma coils, and the inside of all the little dials. You can of course pick whatever parts, if any, that you want to be glowing based on your preference, but I went for quite a few, since the glow was sort of the main point of interest in this paint scheme. Most importantly, I made the eye lenses and the little helmet ocular thing glow, but I wanted even more, so I made the drop pack engine parts glow, as well as all of the little recessed vent line things. My advice would be that whatever parts you pick to be glowing, whether you're following along with painting some Aquilons as well, or if you're painting other minis and just taking inspiration from this painting process, is to consistently pick motifs all around the Mini to be glowing. What I mean by this is that if you make some of the lenses glow, you should probably make all of the similar looking lenses on the Mini also glow. If you pick one group of these like 3 vent lines to be glowing, for example, you should probably also make all of the groups of 3 vent lines all around the Mini glow. Obviously, there's no rule saying that you have to do this, but I do think that it helps to keep the models looking pretty visually consistent. Back onto the highlights, I highlighted all of the black leathers and guns with first a mix of gray and then a sort of lighter gray mix, and then I mixed some Bane gray and bright ivory, somewhat thinned down, and used that to edge highlight some of the armor panels. I think this part is pretty optional. The dry brushing did a pretty decent job at highlighting these armor panels enough to show through still after the wash, but I just wanted to boost the contrast on these highlights a little bit more, so I applied another highlight by brush. I used a bright bronze color to do one quick highlight on the metals, and then it was on to refining the sort of orangey accent armor panels. Aside from the glowing effects, these are really the only other piece of visual pop and interest on the minis, so I'm making these pretty bright and saturated. I started with some thin, very rough volumetric highlights, mixing orange-brown up with some bright ivory, doing this in several passes. At the moment, it's very bright, but I haven't got it very orangey colored at all, and it's very desaturated. So I added some saturation back in by glazing this meaty ochre color over all the highlights and midtones, and then doing the same with P3 Bogran Brown a couple of times, just kind of using this as a thick glaze that tones down the bright colors, smooths out the transitions and midtones, and generally just boosts the orangey saturation. On the backpack panels, I also didn't really place these highlights realistically. Instead, I placed them next to the vents that will be glowing. I'm more concerned with dramatic effect here than I am with perfect realism of light placement. Once I was happy with the color, I just edge highlighted all of these panels with pure pale yellow. And with that, everything's in place to return to the airbrush, and I carefully airbrushed a turquoise color around all of the glowing OSL items. In testing, I tried out a few different things, like first airbrushing pure white onto these areas and then airbrushing a bright blue speed paint over top, but honestly, it kind of just ended up with the same result as just airbrushing a turquoise acrylic paint, but with more steps. So I think now everything looks nice and radiant, but I think the OSL is missing its punch now. To get it back, I dotted a somewhat thinned down pure white into the core of the glows to bring them back to maximum brightness. For the lenses, this means that I put a pretty large dot of white in the center of the lens as a circle, and for things like the vents on the backpacks and guns and such, I picked one side of the vent to be the bright side, which usually is either the inside or the bottom side or the more visible side, and I put white on that side of it, leaving the other half turquoise. Then I mixed together turquoise and white, thinned it down a decent amount, and used that to edge highlight around all of the glow effects. I also used it to smooth out the transition between the turquoise and the white, if at any point I decided that it looked a little bit too stark of a transition. Now I have made these glows super intense, probably to the point where some people might not really like how extreme it looks, but part of that is just my painting style, in that I like to paint with a really high amount of contrast, and part of it is because, as I mentioned earlier, the rest of the minis are black, gray, or brown, and I really wanted to add some interest and color to these minis, and really make them pop and stand out when played with on the tabletop. Also, when I paint OSL, I like to totally go ham, because if you're painting a cool glow effect, you might as well, go for it and really make it pop. That's the first mini basically done, so now it's on to the no airbrush variant, which is really not too different at all. It's just subbing out a few steps, mostly at the start and at the end, and using dry brushing instead of airbrushed OSL effects. So for this non-airbrushed mini, I picked the Plasma Gunner, and started off with any old neutral gray primer. Before I settled on picking this mini as my no airbrush example, I did a bit of zenithal highlighting and dry brushing with white, but honestly it's all about to get covered up, and that part really doesn't matter at all. To start things off, I base coated almost the entire mini in a mix of Grim Black and Noble Skin, only avoiding things that are really big glowing items like the plasma coils. The black parts don't seem to really be black enough for me, so after this dried I used a thin coat of pure black to really darken them down. And when that's all dry, I heavily dry brushed the whole mini with gray. This will serve as a highlight for the black, and at the same time start lightening the values of the other surfaces to help out the somewhat translucent upcoming layers and highlights. Then I mixed Crix Green and Bane Gray, thinned down quite a bit, to do a sort of very thin layer or base coat over the armor bits that I wanted to be a grayish green. Then to get the gray armor to a similar look of the airbrushed mini, I did a few dry brushing steps, first dry brushing all the armor bits with Bane Gray, and then with a mix of Bane Gray and Bright Ivory. And then honestly at this point, the mini now looks pretty much similar to the airbrushed version at this stage. This one is a little bit grittier and a little bit less smooth, but it's not bad at all when compared side by side. Then at this point, I copied all the same steps that I showed previously, blocking in all of the other colors, and then using a black and brown wash mix over everything. Now when the wash has dried, honestly you can see by the side by side, I think they look basically identical. I don't really think you would ever even know which one was airbrushed or wasn't airbrushed. Then onto the highlight steps. These are all also the exact same as before, nothing different here. Where it does diverge is where we get to painting the glowing parts though. Instead of airbrushing turquoise, I started by applying a thin layer of mixed turquoise and white applied to the glowing surfaces themselves. Then I did a heavy dry brush of turquoise around them, using a somewhat large and soft brush. I applied thinned white paint into the core part of the glow effect, same as before, and used a glaze or two of turquoise to boost the OSL effect where needed, also doing the same turquoise and white mix edge highlight if it's also needed. When you really zoom in, this does look a little bit messier, in part though just because I was going fast and kind of rushed it on the dry brushing. But I also think it's important to keep in mind the goals of a paint job. For my kill teams, for example, I want a good tabletop plus look, whatever that means to you, but I don't want to spend ages painting just one team. And ultimately, these are gaming pieces for me, and when you're looking from 2 feet away on a busy game board, all those little imperfections will kind of just melt away and disappear. Anyway, one last note, on things like the plasma coils, I did push the color of the raised coil edges a little bit darker, using darker blue colors. With both of those minis done now, The last thing is the bases, and I won't really bother covering in detail how I painted them. It's just using some greens, stone gray, and dark gray colors, and doing some rough dry brushed highlights and shading, then putting a bunch of rust effect paints on the metal bits. I varnished all these minis with my airbrush with a mix of matte and satin varnish, which was mainly for two reasons. I usually only use matte varnish, but I wanted to hopefully keep a little bit of shine in the metals, plus the bit of satin in there should help to make the shadow colors look a bit deeper. And that is another kill team complete. I am really pleased with how this team turned out. I think that the intense glowing parts really pop on the table visually. There are some other bits on these minis, like a few unhelmeted faces and berets and stuff like that I didn't really go over how I painted, but I just painted those in a pretty standard way, just base coats and layered highlights, nothing fancy to report. One of the minis did have a power sword, and one of them also had a knife that I painted as sort of like a power knife that was glowing as well, but at the time I didn't think to record footage of painting those. But basically I just painted gradients from white through turquoise and onto blue, using my airbrush to smooth the gradients on them. As always, I'm happy to help if you have any questions for me about anything I covered, or anything I didn't cover in this video, I guess. Also, I don't care at all about YouTube metrics, but it does really brighten my day a bit when people like and leave nice comments on my videos, so do that if you want to, or don't, that's also alright. So with that, I'll see you in the next video where I show how I painted my Volcus terrain. Take care, I hope you stay safe and healthy, and have a great rest of your day.